And you're going to hear a little bit about one of those special sectors, individual artists, and how they are part of this ecosystem. What are their concerns? And they've raised these concerns over the years. Deirdre McPherson is our Chief Community Officer and really is a right hand driving so much of our work connected to community, connected to individual artists and other parts of the sector.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone. As you know, Assembly for the Arts, we were commissioned by Cuyahoga Arts and Culture and had additional support that was essential from the Gunn Foundation to complete a Support for Artists listening campaign. And this campaign consisted of a survey that we emailed and promoted and tried to get as much engagement and support and feedback from the community, as well as a series of 4 listening sessions. So we did 3 in person and 1 virtually. And our goal with this project was to determine how to invest tax dollars, $400,000 specifically, in individual artists. And so the best way to program for artists is to hear directly from the artists that we serve. And so that was essential, and we thank all of you who participated in that work. And as Jeremy mentioned, this campaign was a refresh. I wanted to acknowledge the artists who really informed and participated in this work years ago, and we've held on to that, and what artists have shared with us is really important to our work. We definitely want to honor the input and insights that artists have shared with us over the years, and we got to elaborate on that and hear from additional people this time around. And so to help us with this work, we hired a research consultant, Dr. Brea Heidelberg, who is in Philadelphia. She's based in Philadelphia, but she joined us to facilitate these listening sessions, and she advised us on the survey. And in addition to this work to inform our campaign, our staff, Meg Matko, Veronica Thornton, myself, and Jeremy, we've had ongoing conversations with the arts community over the years and over the last few months especially, really getting their input to help us thoughtfully consider how to best move forward with artist funding, realizing that it's not enough. We do need to increase the size of the pie. We do need to have more investment and money that goes directly to artists that's in an unrestricted fashion. So to help us get ready to share the results of this listening campaign, which took place like late July through late September, we've invited Dr. Brea Heidelberg to share the results of that study with you today, and she's joining us virtually. So I also want to thank Raise the Roof, who's helping us with all the technology today to make sure we were able to Zoom Dr. Heidelberg in from Philadelphia. And so I welcome you to enjoy her presentation. And if you're able, please stick around because we'd like to continue the discussion. When we do, the new year does start in 2024, we'll be having more experiences where we're bringing people together to discuss things, because these ongoing conversations are essential to unifying the arts community and being proactive in our programming moving forward. So for that, I would like to say hi to Dr. Brea Heidelberg. You see her, she's zoomed in, and I'll pass the mic to her for now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know that you are short on time and that I want to leave time for the Q&A that's going to happen afterwards, so I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to provide an overview of the charge that my consulting company was given, the methodology that we took, and the overview of the main recommendations that are present in the report. The charge was to provide input on an independent artist survey, as was mentioned, conduct 4 listening sessions with Cleveland artists, and then provide recommendations that would be a part of an overall recommendation package to CAC that is specifically focused on both independent artists and investigating the utility or desire for an artist advisory board. In preparation for the listening sessions, myself and my team looked at the previous report, the Support for Artists Planning Team created in 2017. We looked at the previous survey that went out in 2019. We also looked at available media outlets with anything that was publicly available, providing information about independent artists' life, needs, struggles, desires in Cleveland. And we also looked at the Community Engagement and Planning Grant final reporting guidelines, all for insights into the lay of the land and what has come before so that our methods could be informed by that. Furthermore, we developed a listening session protocol that focused on creating a psychologically safe space, which became apparent that there was a need for that based on the previous methods that the investigation that I just mentioned. We wanted to help artists articulate their experiences in ways that would be legible, not only from a research standpoint, but also from a recommendation standpoint, like how to make those things actionable. We wanted to help artists identify areas of strength and areas of challenge or concern. And we also wanted to provide a environment and space that would allow artists to articulate their understanding of the local arts ecosystem and their place in it. And understanding that lay of the land, or how local artists understand that lay of the land, is an integral part of in our methodology of figuring out recommendations that are not only actionable, but reasonable moving forward. The other thing is that we wanted to acknowledge that not all artists feel comfortable speaking up in a large public forum. Part of the reason that I was brought in and my team was brought in is that we have no control over funding decisions. And so not having any of our personal identity or ego tied to it helps provide some sort of psychological space and distance, but that might not have been enough in the moment. And so in addition to the open forum listening sessions, I also provided an email address for people to share their thoughts and feedback and responses and concerns. And a large number of people chose that forum, even though they were present at the listening sessions. They opted to provide that type of feedback instead. So we were really glad that we offered that opportunity because it provided additional context and nuance and a wealth of other data sources for us. So as was mentioned, there were 4 listening sessions, and I provide the dates and the format. There was one in Zoom, the other 3 were in person. I provided the address so that it's clear that there was an attempt on the part of Assembly to make sure that the listening sessions were occurring outside of just one central location. So different communities were hopefully represented. We do acknowledge that this is a convenience sample, that people had to self-identify as an artist, but anybody who did was welcome to attend, but people had to make the choice to attend. They also had to have the opportunity to attend. We tried to make it so that people with various caregiving responsibilities had times that might work for them. And so that's why we offered multiple sessions at different time points. And now to the rest of it. So an overview of the findings. The main takeaways was that there is a need for restorative action that I will go into in just a minute, a deep perception of disrespect from artists. So artists feel deeply disrespected by the longstanding history of policy and procedure and outcomes over the course of an extended period of time. There's also confusing and cumbersome administrative processes that either implicitly or explicitly bar independent artists from fully engaging in the funding opportunities. There's also a lack of support for aging artists that emerged as a part of our findings. And then one of the charges was to see if there was a need or desire for an artist advisory board. And while there were some suggestions given as to what that advisory board could potentially be, overall participants had a deep aversion to that. And a lot of that is filtered through the overarching theme of the perception of disrespect. So the need for restorative action here was really encapsulated both in our background research and in the actual participant sessions. We were able to ascertain that there were 3 main chunks of time that need to be accounted for. So over a number of years, 2009 to 2016, artists in the arts community became increasingly aware of funding disparities that disproportionately disadvantaged BIPOC artists. And in response to that, there was the Support for Artists team that was formed did its work, did an extensive amount of work, a large number of meetings, a large number of document analysis. They came up with recommendations, and the artists and arts community were disheartened and frustrated, not only from what they learned about individual artist support throughout their work, but also by the reception of their final reports. And then from 2019 to present, artists in the arts community are increasingly angry about the fact that those recommendations were never fully adopted, but there appears to be a practice of co-opting the labor for talking points divorced from the work and the calls for substantive change. And so to further explain what I mean by that, on one side of your screen, you have the Support for Artists Planning Team recommendations, which came with extensive rationale and explanation for what they mean by these words: funding, art market opportunities, space and time. I took some liberties by putting the ING on network, but network opportunities, the creation of network and the maintenance of networking. And then education, which is more broad of a conceptualization than the professional development that you see on the other side. As stated in the 2023 Support for Artists Community Engagement and Planning Grant, the Cuyahoga Arts and Culture has translated those findings into flexible funds, project funding, access to space, institutional connections, and professional development. And based on the wealth of information provided by the Support for Arts Planning Team in that extensive document, it is reasonable for the artists and the arts community to feel disrespected in the way that their findings have been translated. And that's because, usually whenever we're doing document analysis, we remove ourselves from the presumption of intent and we focus on the impact. However, with a document and the work as extensive as what the Support for Arts Planning Team was, they very clearly articulated and codified, essentially, the intent behind their words. So when we see something like the shift from networking opportunities translated into institutional connections, the intent on the part of the artist planning team was that artists would like to be in community with one another. They want to be able to deepen their knowledge base and also deepen and expand their abilities to create a structure and functioning arts ecosystem that is self-contained, that necessarily isn't self-contained, but is autonomous, controlled by artists and those that understand the creative process. The translation to something like institutional connections maintains the hierarchy and the status of institutional gatekeepers, right? And so that shift, even though it might seem like the same thing is being said, the impact and often the intent behind the intermediaries, who's involved, who has control and who doesn't, is a significant shift with just a small turn of phrase. And so I spent some extra time on that because I think this is a very potent way of encapsulating what artists say and what the arts community says or means whenever they say, our work has been co-opted, our intent has been misconstrued, our work has been deeply disrespected by the lack of action as a result of what we've done, and also the fact that these words have been altered in ways that has significant policy and procedural impact. So the top recommendation here is to explicitly acknowledge and apologize for the strained relationship between CAC and local artists, because without that acknowledgement of the impact, and again, in this particular context, because I don't have our research did not unearth additional understanding of the intent behind CAC words and actions, we are just focusing on the impact. The impact is harm. and longstanding harm and compounding harm. And so without explicit acknowledgement and apology and restorative action for that, as stated in the report, the rest of the recommendations may largely be rendered useless. Because of this second and overarching theme, which is the perception of disrespect. And as a function of the exploitation and erasure of artist work, particularly as it pertains to that report, but in other manifestations that were provided in more detail and more context throughout the listening sessions and in the emails that were received. Deep distrust overrides interpretations of CAC programmatic and funding choices. Yes, there are a number of funding opportunities for BIPOC artists that are filtered through local BIPOC led and serving institutions, but the longstanding history of disproportionate funding that were at $20,000 funding marks for individual artists, as opposed to the $5,000 grants available as a result of this, shift in policy and procedure. That disrespect is filtered through the presumption of disrespect. And because there is no alternative rationale provided, that's what's going to stand. There's no additional acknowledgement there. That's what's going to stand. So the actions of CAC are continuously and reasonably, I would say, given the things that we heard and the data that we were able to gather, filtered through this understanding or this presumption of disrespect for individual artists, for local artists, based on, the number of grants that go to bring artists from outside Cleveland into Cleveland, the amount of grant funding that goes to large flagship institutions who only provide lip service to engaging meaningfully with local artists, but who do not do so in practice and are not held accountable for it, the number of community-led and resident-focused grant processes and opportunities that tend to, or there's a perception of being disproportionately granted to non-artists. So educational institutions, mental health service institutions, other health organizations receiving arts-based funding at the expense of actual artists who do not receive that funding. All of that is filtered through this understanding, or can compound this perception of longstanding disrespect. Recommendations there would be to prioritize artist-led proposals, especially for resident and community-centered funding. Prioritize proposals that highlight the work of artists who live in Cleveland proper. There was also a number of participants that mentioned that, yes, if you are a BIPOC artist from the suburbs, where there is differing levels of politics of respectability, socioeconomic access, and class, those issues come together, and those artists do receive funding, often at the perception of a disproportionate rate to BIPOC artists that live in Cleveland proper. Alter general operating support, shifting money towards funding independent artists from other organizational or institutional-based funding, and finally, making meaningful local artist engagement a funding requirement for the local flagship institutions who receive a significantly disproportionate amount of funding. So making that requirement that they use some of that funding to, again, meaningful is a purposeful word inserted there, meaningful local artist engagement is a recommendation, and then also including with that accountability mechanisms and structures for them meeting that requirement, with the possibility of loss or shifting of funding as a result if they don't adhere to that recommendation. Confusing and cumbersome administrative processes were another element that showed up a number of times. Artists are fatigued by the grant application process. Part of the function of having various institutions as funding intermediaries means that there are often conflicting grant processes and deadlines. People cannot keep track of the funding structure. And it's not just in this particular instance about CAC, but it's CAC in collaboration or in communication with the other funding sources that exist within the Cleveland area. artists said that keeping up with the grant cycle is a full-time job. And once you miss one or two, you can be knocked off of track for 1 to 2 years. Artists repeatedly mentioned, needing to like jump back on, but being very confused as to when and how to do that. The procedure of actually applying for grants and not having access to all of the questions all at once, not being able to print their applications once they've submitted one, so that they can see or keep track of the questions that they'll be asked, instead of having to reinvent the wheel every time they go through a particular granting process. Understanding the upfront, the cost for application, if they need to take pictures of or have samples of their work. Not everybody's work is sampleable in the same way. And sometimes it could be cost prohibitive to provide samples, especially given the amount of money that is provided in the grants. So at some point, the return on investment for time spent needs to be acknowledged in this. If it is a 3-hour process to get things together for less than what an hour of an artist's time costs, then there needs to be some grappling with that. There's also structural biases for 501c3 status and fiscal sponsorship that are problematic for a number of artists. There are longstanding artists with 10 or 15, 20 years of experience who don't want to incorporate as a 501c3, but are forced to in order to become eligible. But once they do that administrative process, which has a cost attached to it, then they are considered too inexperienced to be eligible for many of the grants that they got the 501c3 status for, because while they might have 20 years of experience, administratively they only exist, which is problematic in and of itself, but they only exist in their infancy administratively. Finally, funding restrictions that do not acknowledge or respect creative processes were also a factor. So if there are only funds available to be used towards buying new materials, but many artists in Cleveland, and I would say Cleveland is a leader in this, are working on sustainable art practices. Many artists use found materials, but they have to make up spending money on a new stapler because that's the only way that they can get the funds, or the only ways that they're allowed to use the funds. This particular finding also had an element of that lack of respect because artists feel like if I'm good enough to get this grant, you should trust me to spend it on what it needs to be spent on in the process of making my creation, in the process of doing my art. I shouldn't have to fill out 20 pieces of paper to get these additional paper clips when I don't have the same expectation of transparency or understanding about how the funding institution itself spends its money. And there were other people in some of the sessions that said, and yes, we understand that CEC provides publicly accessible documents for how they spend their money, but the relative readability and understanding of that needs to be considered. So yes, it might exist written down somewhere, but that's not the same as the extensive processes that you're asking people to engage in order to justify the money that they've been given. Recommendations there would be to create, maintain, and work with all the subgranting institutions to align one calendar for each grant cycle, create more streamlined and transparent processes that are consistent as much as possible from year to year, being mindful of the relative cost of engaging in the application process and considering that as a factor when creating those processes is also recommended. Removing as much as possible 501c3 or fiscal sponsorship requirements, removing funding restrictions, because what the messaging is, whether that's implicit or explicit, is that artists don't deserve the right to make a living from their work, because we're not providing funding for your housing, your artist space, your food, your caregiving responsibilities, what it costs to live as a human. We will only provide money if you are producing something in a very narrowly defined definition of what it means to produce. Finally, in order to meet some of those charges, you would need to provide larger grants overall. Lack of support for aging artists came up in each of the sessions. And elder artists would like to continue working as artists, but they are increasingly mindful of some of the stuff that I just mentioned. There's no funding for living. There's only funding for the creative, usually product, not necessarily process, but creative product. And so things like housing, healthcare, how to feed themselves, is creating new issues as artists age. It's also very difficult to keep up with the required hustle of constantly applying for small pieces of money to put together to be able to fund a project as artists get older. So the thing to be mindful here for these recommendations, for all of the funding restrictions and funding like proposals, what is stated does not always align with the lived experiences of the artists, right? And so the messaging about what it means to be an artist and whether or not they are respected for their process and their work, those messages are both explicit and implicit, but all of those need to be acknowledged. And it's not going to impact everybody in the organization or a relative organization or the arts ecosystem in the same way. And that needs to be accounted for and not divorced from the history of funding. Another thing is the desire for increased civic engagement. So artists have a strong desire and they have so many solutions to some of the local issues facing Cleveland. They want to be a part of local initiatives, and they want to be a part of those local initiatives in non-exploitative ways. And by that, I mean, they are very well aware of the Richard Florida of it all, of being brought in to make a space cool, to artistify a space, only to have that neighborhood, that space, that community then be given over to developers that then price them out. They are also very well aware of having tried to be a part of solutions, only to have administrative red tape stand in their way. Artists talked about wanting to take over vacant lots or to at least beautify or use as artistic and creative spaces abandoned lots, only to, be chased after by the city for engaging with the abandoned lot. There's exasperation, anger, and sadness over constantly being overlooked as part of the solution or only brought into conversations when it's time to put an ornament on something and not necessarily when it's time to be discussing solutions. Artists need to be brought in on more than just what are writ large considered art-based issues. Things like widening roads, things like changing traffic patterns, the use of buildings, new medical facilities. All of these things should include artists because artists are citizens. And they have lots of ideas for how to improve Cleveland and their respective neighborhoods. So there need to be opportunities for local artists to be included in conversations about civic and social issues in meaningful ways. So this is another one where that in meaningful ways was added. Finally, this is the process of the organizational culture, the history, the institutional history of these stories and elements for the personal development of all of the artists. That's something that they have already been engaged in over time, and that it was acknowledged in the opening comments. But there's a deeper version to an advisory board because the messaging is just like, we've already been here. Even in the participant sessions, there was lots of frustration, even with our team, for existing or being there or asking these questions because the questions have largely been asked before. And so until there is an understanding of what's going to happen, people don't want to continue throwing good time after bad. So The recommendation here is to critically reflect on why there is a desire to have an advisory board or continued desire to have an advisory board, so that getting at those actual goals can be managed in perhaps different ways that are more respective of the history that exists, which will require being open to other ways of continuing engagement with artists and determining how to acknowledge and incorporate artist feedback before you continue to gather it. People need to see, okay, so I've expended my time and energy and provided this feedback, but I've also done that in 2017, 2019, 2022, 2023, and what has come of it. And so people need to see a strong good faith effort and have a firm understanding of the policies and procedures in place to acknowledge and incorporate their feedback before you continue to ask it of them. So in conclusion, the overarching recommendation that we came up with was that there needs to be consistency, openness, transparency, and restorative action. All of these things will be vital parts of the work ahead. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share there. And thank you all for your time. And for all the artists that participated either in person or virtually or via email, our deepest gratitude for your willingness to engage in the process and for sharing your vulnerabilities and your pain points as well as the happy points with all of us.